Our next two lessons are 1.6 and 1.7, and they're focusing on adding whole numbers and subtracting whole numbers. So I figured we'd do these two lessons together. We're not going to spend too much time on adding. We're going to spend a little bit more time on subtracting. But what's important when we go through this lesson is we're not only adding and subtracting, but we're also going to be estimating our sums or estimating our differences before we actually solve our problem. So let's take a look at some addition first. Here we see the problem 397 plus 285, and we're going to start with estimating our sum. When we're adding and we get an answer, it's called a sum. So we're going to start by estimating that sum. In order for us to estimate, we're going to round our numbers. We're going to generally round to our greatest place value. So in this case, we're going to round to the hundreds place of both numbers. Whenever we're rounding, it's very important that we're rounding to the same place value of our numbers. So if you had two numbers and they had two different greatest place values, you want to round to the smallest of the two of the greatest place values. We'll take a look at one of those in a little bit. Let's start out with this problem. When we look at 397 and we round to the hundreds place, that number would round to 400. And when we take a look at 285, that number would round to 300. And when we add those two together, we get 700 as our estimate. Now, the reason why we estimate is to make sure that the answers that we come up with when we're all done adding are similar to our estimate. They're not going to be the same, but we do want to estimate so that we make sure that we're in the right ballpark. Once we found our estimate, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add. When we add, we always start in the ones place or the smallest place value, and we work our way to the greatest place value. So we'll start with 7 plus 5, and that gives us 12. We put our ones place down, and we carry our tens place to the tens place. Then we have 9 plus 1 is 10, plus 8 more gives us 18. I'm going to put my tens down. I'm going to carry my hundreds. And then I have 1 plus 3, that's 4, plus 2 more, and that's 6. Now, when we look at our end number, when we look at our sum here, we're going to compare it to our estimate, and these are pretty close. We rounded to the hundreds place, and so they should be within around 50 of each other, which they are. So 682 is close to our estimate of 700. There we go. Okay, let's take a look at another problem. This problem is going to be a little bit bigger, and we're going to start with our estimate. Here we see numbers that are quite a bit larger than what we just looked at. These numbers are in the hundred thousands place and the 10,000s place. And remember, for the last problem that I talked about when we were finding our estimate, I mentioned that it's really important that we estimate to the same place value. If we take a look at this number, our 800 here is in our hundred thousands place, but there's nothing over here in our second number in our hundred thousands place. So if we rounded to our hundred thousands place, we would be adding 900,000 plus 0, because if we rounded 21,923 to the hundred thousands place, it would give us 0. We don't want to have 0 when we're adding something. So in order for us to estimate this number, we are actually going to be taking a look at the 10,000s place of both numbers. It's really important that we round to the same place value. So if we round to our 10,000s place for these numbers, we would have 870,000. This would round up because this number is 5 or greater, so we would add 1 more. And our second number would be 20,000 as our rounded number. When we're adding this, we'd look at the neighbor, that's 4 or less, so we'd ignore all those other digits. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add down. So we start in our ones place and add all of those zeros, and then 0 plus 0 is 0 in our thousands, 7 plus 2 in our 10,000s is 9, and then our 100,000s is our 8. So our estimate for this addition problem is 890,000. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at our actual addition problem. And we're always going to start adding from our ones place. So we're going to add 8 plus 7 and we get 15. We always put the ones place of that number down and carry the tens. 1 plus 1 is 2, plus 2 more is 4. 2 plus 9 in our hundreds place, that's going to give us 11, and I carry my other 1. 1 plus 5 is 6, plus 1 more is 7, and that's going to be in my thousands place. 6 plus 2 is 8, and then my 100,000s place, 8 plus nothing is 8. So I'm left with 887,145. When I take a look at my sum and I take a look at my estimate, they are very, very close. 890,000 is very close to 887,145. So I can be pretty confident in my answer because it's very close to my estimate. All right. That's all about addition. You guys are pretty good of carrying that number and making sure that we're adding all of those correctly. Just make sure we're not going too fast and that when we do carry our numbers over, we carry them into the next place value. Let's go ahead and take a look at subtraction. And what I find when you subtract is sometimes we don't always borrow from the right number. So that's what we're really going to focus on with subtraction. Here we have a number. We're going to start pretty small. We have 302 minus 189. And for this, we're also going to start with an estimate. We're going to round our numbers to the hundreds place because both of them are in the hundreds place. So we're going to start with 300 for our bigger number. And we're going to round our second number to 200. It's closer to 200 than it is to 100. This 8 forces my 1 to add 1 more. So that's what I'm going to make sure I do with my hundreds place. And when I subtract these two numbers, I'm left with 100 as my estimate. So my final difference, or the answer to my subtraction problem, should be pretty close to 100. Let's take a look. We're going to start by subtracting in our ones place. We'd start in our ones place or our smallest place value for both addition and subtraction. Now, if our ones place in our smaller digit is greater than our ones place in our larger number, then we're going to have to do some regrouping. Here we have a 9 in our ones place and we have a 2 in our ones place. We cannot take 9 away from 2, so we're going to have to borrow from our neighbor. We go next door to our 0, but we can't borrow from a 0. There's no value there yet. So we need to go next door all the way over to our 3, and we're going to borrow from our 3. Now when we're borrowing, it's really important that we cross that number out and borrow from it first. Think about it this way. If you're trying to make some cookies and you don't have any sugar at your house, you can't make the cookies without sugar and then go next door and borrow the sugar and then dump all the sugar on top of your cookies. Your cookies are not going to taste good. You have to go next door and borrow the sugar and then come back and bake your cookies. So the same concept applies here. We need to borrow first before we can add something over. So we're going to borrow from our 3, and that's going to become a 2. We reduce that by 1. We're borrowing 100, so we need to bring that to here. And now we have 10 tens. Okay? We have 10 tens now in our tens place. Now we can go back to our ones place. We haven't borrowed anything there yet. And we can now go over to our tens place. And we're going to borrow from our tens place, and that's going to become a 9. And our ones place is going to become a 12. Now we can subtract. So we have 12 minus 9. That gives me 3. 9 minus 8 gives me 1. And 2 minus 1 gives me 1. So my final difference is 113. I take a look at my final difference. I take a look at my estimate. They're very close. That's a good indication that I'm in the right direction. There's a way for me to check my work with subtraction. I'm going to take the difference that I got and I'm going to add it to my other part. When we're doing subtraction, we have a whole. Here would be our whole, the bigger number, and then these two pieces, this would be my whole, and this would be one part of that number, this would be the other part of that number. I can add both of those parts, and they should equal my whole. So I'm going to take my 113, that was my difference, and add it to my 189, and when I do this, I should end up with my whole of 302. 3 plus 9 is 12. 1 plus 1 is 2, plus 8 is 10. 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. Is this equal to my whole? Yes, it is. So that means I subtracted correctly. I had to go over and borrow the sugar before I made the cookies. Let's take a look at another problem. This one's a little bit bigger. This is in the thousands, and I'm going to start with my estimate. And both numbers are in the thousands place, so I can estimate and round those numbers to the thousands place. My 6, I look at its neighbor. It's a 1. That's 4 or less, so I'm going to ignore those, and this is going to round to 6,000. I'm then going to subtract. I look at my neighbor. It's a 2. That's 4 or less, so I'm going to ignore it, and that's going to be rounded to 4,000. And I'm going to subtract those two. When I subtract 6,000 minus 4,000, I'm left with 2,000, and that's my estimate. Now I'm going to go in and I am going to find the difference. I'm going to start in my ones place. So I have a 4 in my larger digit and a 9 in my smaller digit. I can't take 9 away from 4, so I need to look at my neighbor. It's a 0 again. I can't borrow from my 0, so I need to go next door one more place. Here's a 1. I can borrow from my 1. So I'm going to borrow from the 1, and that's going to turn to 0. Then my tens place becomes a 10. Now I can borrow from my tens place. I borrow from my tens place, it turns to a 9. My ones place becomes 14. Now I can subtract my ones place. 14 minus 9 is 5. 9 minus 9 is 0. 0 minus 2. I can't do that. So I'm going to need to borrow again. But notice, I didn't cross a whole bunch of numbers out at the beginning. I have to go place by place. So now I'm going to start in my hundreds place, and I have a 2. And I have a 0, and I can't subtract those, so I'm going to borrow from my neighbor. I'm going to look over to my thousands place. I'm going to borrow 1,000 from here, add it over here. Now I can subtract 10 minus 2, and that gives me 8, and 5 minus 4 gives me 1. So my final difference is 1,805. And that's pretty close to my estimate of 2,000. I can always go and check my work with addition. The bigger number on my top was my whole. This is one of my parts, and this is my other part. So I'm going to add my two parts together, 4,299 plus 1,805. And this should give me my whole of 6,104. 9 plus 5 is 14. I carry my 1. 1 plus 9 is 10, plus 0 gives me 10. 1 plus 2 gives me 3, plus 8 is 11. And then 1 plus 4 is 5, plus 1 more is 6. And does this equal my whole that I started with up top? Yes, it does. That means I subtracted correctly. Not only is my difference close to my estimate, but then I was able to check my work with addition. Let's take a look at another one. Here I have 43,211 minus 35,733, and I'm going to start with my estimate. I am going to look in my 10,000s place, and I'm going to round these numbers in my 10,000s place. When I round my number in my 10,000s place here, I'm looking at its neighbor. That is a 3, so my 4 is going to stay the same, and I have 4,000. And when I look over here, my 5 is going to make me add one more over here. Oops, not first 4,000. I have 40,000. And here I have 40,000 too. Now, would it make sense if I subtracted this and I got 0? Would that give me a good indication of what my final answer should be? When you end up rounding and you find an estimate and both of your numbers are the same, that's not going to give you a good idea if you subtract it or not. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to round my numbers again. And this time, instead of rounding to my 10,000s place, I'm going to round to my thousands place. This way, when I subtract, I can see a little bit clearer if I'm close to my estimate. Because it's really hard to see, okay, I know I'm not going to get 0 when I subtract these numbers. They're not the same. I'm going to round to my thousands place this time. Right here, my neighbor's a 2, so my 3 is going to stay the same, and I have 43,000 minus. Here, my neighbor's a 7. It's going to make me add one more, so I'm going to have 36,000. All right, when I subtract this time, I am going to be left with 7,000. So my estimate's 7,000. My difference should be close to 7,000. Let's go ahead and start subtracting. All right, I'm going to start in my ones place. In my ones place, I have a 1 and a 3. I cannot take 3 away from 1, so I'm going to go and borrow from my neighbor. There's a 1 over here. I can borrow from that 1. That 1 is going to become a 0. And my 1 in my ones place turns into 11. 11 minus 3. That's going to give me the number 8. Now I'm going to move on to my next place. I have a 0 minus 3. I can't do that, so I'm going to go and I'm going to borrow from my 2. It's going to become a 1, and my 0 becomes a 10. 10 minus 3 is 7. I'm moving on to my hundreds place. I have 1 minus 7. I can't do that, so I need to go and borrow. I'm going to borrow from my 3. It's going to become a 2. And now I have 11. 11 minus 7 is going to give me 4. Now I'm moving on to my thousands place. I'm going to have to borrow again in my thousands place because right now I have 2 minus 5. So I'm going to go on over to my 10,000s place and I'm going to borrow 1. And that becomes 12 for me. 12 minus 5 is going to give me 7, and 3 minus 3 is 0. Notice, I did not go all the way through and borrow all the way through. We're going to borrow one place value at a time, solve that one place value, and see if you need to continue to borrow. You don't always have to, so don't go through everything and then figure out, oh, I didn't actually need to borrow. One step at a time. Here's my answer, 7,478, which is close to my estimate. I'm going to check my work with addition. Here is my whole, here's my part, here's my other part. So I'm going to add my parts together. 35,733 plus 7,478. And let's see if I get the whole I started with. Notice how you line up all of your place values. That's super important. 3 plus 8 gives me 11. 4, 1 plus 3 is 4, plus 7 gives me 11. 1 plus 7 is 8, plus 4 more is 12. I put my 2 and carry my 1. 1 plus 5 is 6, plus 7 is 13. And then 1 plus 3 is 4. 43,211, that's what I have at my hole up here at the top. That's my hole here. I did that correctly. That is my correct difference. Okay, I want you to go ahead, practice some addition, practice some subtraction. Make sure you estimate your sum first. I'm going to ask you for your estimate and for your actual sum or your difference. When you're done with that, that's the end of your lesson. And then tomorrow we will move on to some word problems.